Great. Well, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Heckert today to the North Carolina Fossil Club to speak to us about dinosaur paleopathology and looking at sick dinosaurs and what that tells us about them. I will confess to being an unabashed paleo groupie. And I know that whenever Dr. Eckert comes to visit us, we always get record crowds, and it looks like today is no exception for our Zoom calls. So I'm really delighted he's here. Those of you who may not know it, Appalachian State University grants more geology degrees than any other school in the NC state system. So they really are our local local rock enthusiasts, and we're really, really honored to have them here with us. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Heckert and look forward to hearing what he has to say and all your great questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm going to switch this over to presentation mode, and hopefully it will work. And I probably will not track of the chat while I'm talking, but feel free if there's something along the line that where you have a question about, feel free to drop it in there, and I can definitely, as we wrap up, try to answer it. So yeah, thanks again for having me. Thanks so much for your guys' continued support of paleontology at App, including of Archie, who we were showing off there a little earlier. So yeah, so this is a project that I got involved with quite some time ago, and my co-authors here, Zach is a current undergrad student in our department. Logan graduated some years ago, and Katie was actually the first one that I had working on this project. And then Matt Carano's at the Smithsonian, and we brought him in because we got to a point where we felt like we really could say something, but we wanted to have more statistical basis on it. So this is an ongoing project, but it's kind of a fun thing just to think about in terms of, what can we say about dinosaurs and paleopathologies and so on. And so for some reason there we go. So what's paleopathology itself? And a pocket definition is the study of ancient diseases in humans and non-humans. And diseases really includes both actual disease of some form and also injuries, traumatic things, broken bones or so on. And obviously in vertebrate paleontology, this is restricted to what you can see really in hard tissues. There's a couple of other examples, but really all I'm going to talk about is hard tissues. There are examples of footprints which seem to show damaged, animals with damaged feet. There's a couple of skin impression things. There's a few, but by and large, we're talking about bones. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that the Terror of the South, they're mounted in the rotunda. My recollection is that that one has there's like, you can push a little button and it has little lights, LED lights, which show you all the little abnormalities and pathologies on that specimen. So it's a fundamentally interdisciplinary thing. I mean, you're geologists, but you're now talking about the biology of the skeleton, essentially. And if you just try and go casually into paleopathology, you're going to find that there's a huge amount of it dedicated to human origins and so on. Dinosaur paleopathology is probably the next biggest field, but it's a pretty small one from there on out. Okay, so I think I went 2 slides. I did. Okay, so I've already kind of answered then what is paleopathology, but I mean, one of the things I feel like any talk, I'd always try and drum into my students anytime they present anything, you really should be able to answer all the journalistic questions. So we've done, what is paleopathology? Who studies them? What dinosaurs experience these pathologies? When did they happen, or when were they more or less common? Where on the fossil record were these dinosaurs? What elements do we find them on? And I mean, and so on. So I think these kinds of questions are, it's an opportunity for somebody like me, and I am assuredly not a paleopathologist, to try and get at something a little bit more synthetic, okay? And the way I got into this actually was when I still lived in New Mexico. I did the page layout for this volume by Tanke and Rothschild, where they had compiled all the literature they could on paleopathologies. And I mean all the literature. They had abstracts, they had published papers, but they also had popular accounts. They had even noted where paleopathology had appeared in fiction. So they were really striving for a pretty comprehensive index of this. And I would say that Tanke and Rothschild are really the two people that you're most likely to encounter if you talk about dinosaur paleopathology. Bruce is a MD. I think he's moved around a little bit. When I met him, he was teaching at a medical school in northeastern Ohio. And Darren Tanke is pretty much a self-trained technician. He is at the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Natural History. And they had this long interest in it. And then some other people, including Victoria Arbor, did a postdoc at the museum here in Raleigh, have really talked about these kind of things in terms of looking at specific groups. So Andy Farkey is a acknowledged expert in ceratopsians, Victoria Arbor, of course, on ankylosaurs. And in this last 20 or 30 years, as CT scanning, micro CT scanning, even synchrotron scanning have developed, we can now do much better than we used to. We can really truly look inside the bones, because fossilized bones aren't even that easy to x-ray. You need really pretty heavy duty equipment and so on. But as a field, it exists since there was a guy named Roy Moody who did a lot of pioneering work in the teens and 20s. There's really, that's a way of saying, I guess, that there's very few people who really are paleopathologists, but I want to make sure there's a growing body of work out there. And so just as a thought experiment, of course, and I'm not a fan of this diagram because I hate that the footprints and the skeleton get preserved together. That almost never happens but anyway, so, all right, I mean, we all know the process of fossilization. And if you think about it, right, this is fundamentally a fairly stochastic thing, right? An animal has to die in a place that's amenable to getting buried fairly rapidly, and then get buried and preserved and mineralized and then re-exposed, and somebody has to find the thing, right? And so this is me many, many moons ago out in the San Juan Basin and some Cretaceous strata trying to relocate some bones that a collector had found and tipped us off to. And right, and so somewhere in that landscape, this is sitting out there. That's part of a ceratopsian jaw. You can see some teeth coming out by the Sharpie. And we actually found that while trying to find some of the other stuff he had found. So there's bones out there, but so if getting buried is kind of stochastic, and then if being found is kind of stochastic, and then actually having some sort of injury or pathology preserved on you stochastic, I mean, that would seem like it would be incredibly rare to have anything. And yet there are hundreds and hundreds of pathological specimens of dinosaurs out there. And I mean, we're only talking about, kind of classic dinosaurs. We're not talking about the fossil record of birds at all. We're just talking, classic, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, non-avian dinosaurs. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of specimens out there that have some sort of clear abnormality and that have been described in some way, shape, or form. And so I had done the layout to this, and I thought it was kind of interesting. So what I'm going to try and do next is actually give you some idea how we do this and what's out there. Okay, so of course, to make a paleopathological diagnosis, we're going to invoke uniformitarianism. We're going to assume that structures that we see today that represent healing of injuries are going to look very similar to structures of the past or so on. And so I think the quote down here by like Brett Sermon, it's a very famous quote about being a coroner, except all the witnesses are dead and the evidence has been left out in the rain for 65 million years. And that's kind of grim. But on the other hand, I mean, they're out there. These pathologies are out there. And they might tell us something about modern ecosystems too, because I mean, we're really challenged in that we basically have, of course, wonderful records. I mean, we pretty much know what the human skeleton can and cannot do, both in terms of healing and how diseases might be reflected on it. But we have a lot less good information on things that aren't crop animals, either agricultural animals or pets, right? We have a veterinary database. But what's happening out in the wild, we really have very, very little knowledge of. I mean, we have no idea what percentage of bighorn sheep have injuries on them at any given time, just because it's fundamentally impossible to collect that data. So I wanted to just give you guys some kind of case studies, really nice examples of some of the things that we might see out there in the pathological record. And we chose to make a false dichotomy of injuries versus diseases, acknowledging fully that some diseases are caused by injuries. But in any case, you can pretty rapidly diagnose injuries in dinosaurs, and the vast, vast majority of those injuries are broken and rehealed bones. So a bone that experienced some sort of break, and then just as your bone would, if you've ever broken a bone, there is almost surely a callus that covers over that break. And of course, since no dinosaur had a broken bone set, their calluses are probably proportionately bigger and knottier and more noticeable than they would be on a human limb that had somebody professionally set it. There are paleopathologies that are bite marks, but they're relatively uncommon, and they're a relatively small percentage of the overall bite marks. So that's why I'm trying to say that their breaks are much, much more common than bite marks, because bite marks by themselves are ambiguous. If we don't see some indication that the bone made some effort at healing, if there isn't some indication of healing on that bite mark, then we don't know whether that animal was bitten while it was alive, or whether that's a feeding trace, effectively, of a large theropod dinosaur, pulling meat off of the bone. So there's, thousands and thousands of dinosaur bones that have bite marks on them, but there's relatively few that we know were caused while the animal was living. And then there's some rare other things, like there are some dinosaurs where tendons snapped or something else, and so there's stuff pulled out of whack. And okay, and you guys have all had plenty of time to read the slide. So, the really fascinating thing about these injuries is that these tell us something about the paleobiology of the animal. It really implies that there's some second actor, and so how do these animals interact with each other? And so one of the poster childs for recent research is Triceratops, and of course, I love the far side. Many of us are of a generation where we can all appreciate the far side. And I didn't realize that Vince had light hair when he was younger. So coming in, Schneider, you have plenty of time to do plenty of research to work on, and for the last time, stop making those plastic models fight. But you know what? In 2004, Andy Farkey did exactly that. He took some models that he really liked as very good, accurate models of Triceratops. And he simply, these are the figures from his paper. You can Google this paper if you want. It's free, open access in Paleoelectronica. And he basically showed that there's about 3 different ways that those skulls could lock together. And so, I'm going to show you slides that I actually use in my classes. These are his actual figures. And basically, there's, the color dots just mean that there's different of the models, all 3, depending on how you interlock the horns, there's different places on the skull where you might show, or you might see injuries if one Triceratops locked horns with another. And so, so what I like to do is say, okay, well, now that we know that this is his hypothesis, and this is what he actually saw on dozens of Triceratops skulls. He looked at a lot of Triceratops skulls. Fortunately, Triceratops is a pretty common fossil. And this is what he saw. And I asked students in a classroom where we can have classroom response systems and whatever. So what do you see? Here's effectively a hypothesis. I think that if Triceratops fought each other, they would have injuries in these places. And then here's the data. And I argue in my class, you only get credit if you answer B, right? The data generally support the hypothesis, but they don't perfectly match it. But by and large, the injuries are more or less where you would expect them to be. So that's intriguing. That kind of supports the idea. I mean, I wouldn't say this hypothesis is proven, but it supports the idea that those injuries were probably caused by other Triceratops. And of course, he took some flack on that, and other people argued with him about details, getting into the weeds about it a little bit. And so then he got together with Darren Tanke, and Ewan Wolf is another guy who's done a lot of paleopathology. And this article is also open access. You should be able to access it if you want. And so then they said, okay, people were like, well, you can't really tell that those were made by the horns. And so, that's simplifying the argument. So they took Triceratops and they looked at a bunch of Triceratops skulls. And they took another very well-preserved animal called Centrosaurus, which has even more skulls available to you to study. And they said, well, here's what we see. Here's the number of pathological specimens of Triceratops. Here's the pathological specimens, same bones, in Centrosaurus. And I think we can all agree pretty rapidly. You just start adding up the numbers. There's more Centrosaurus specimens, but there's many more injuries on the Triceratops. And so this really would seem to indicate that Triceratops are engaging each other often and using those horns on each other. And and we actually have up at Appalachian a specimen collected in the 70s in North Dakota, and he used our Triceratops. That's one of these big lesions. It's raised up on a bone. The other one is kind of down here. It's a little harder to see along the edge of the frill, but these are kind of happening right back here on the lower part of the frill. And one of the things I really like to get people to think about with these things is, okay, so that's 10 out of 58. So that's effectively 1 out of every 6 adult Triceratops is wandering around with an injury on its skull, a healed injury on its skull. And then you like to think, well, the chances seem to me that it's very likely that this is in some way or another related to mating, and probably these are bull Triceratops that are doing the fighting, if we can use modern animals as an analog. And so that implies that it may be as many as like 1 out of every 3 bull Triceratops wandering around the landscape has a major injury, an injury trauma to the bone that is healed. So that's really kind of fun. That's sort of fascinating. Like I said, bite marks are really hard to diagnose, but out of the published literature, there are many examples. And so this one on the right is perhaps most spectacular because there's a tooth in there, but there's all this pathological bone. You can't even tell that should be 2 different vertebrae there. And there are other things where there's teeth embedded in neural spines that are broken off and so on. So these are much rarer because the animal needs to survive the bite wound long enough to initiate healing and for that to then get preserved. But they do exist. And one of the things that kind of struck me in putting together this in similar talks is how nice it would be if we had some people out there who could do if any of you guys watch the PBS Eon shows, we need really nice color graphics and things of these bones. We need stuff that's not kind of buried in the published literature. Okay, another of course our all-time favorite Fireside cartoons. It's the Thagomizer, and tribute to this cartoon, Ken Carpenter really did start referring in the scientific literature to the tail spikes of a Stegosaurus as the Thagomizer. That is the official term that we use for the combined anatomical structure there, the tail with the spikes on it. And of course, you guys all know that Thag never lived with any sort of stegosaur. As a matter of fact, Triceratops is 60 million years from us, and we're closer to it than we are to Stegosaurus, of course. But I always feel like it's worth putting in the disclaimer that we know, of course, that no, Thag never got thagomized. But so it's a wonderful term, okay? And you can go back to 1939 and see Stegosaurus using its tail as a defense mechanism in Fantasia. And but that's pretty hard to prove. But again, if we dive into the literature, Ken Carpenter, and this was one of the volunteers at the Denver Museum, Lori McWhinney, I believe her name is, who did the main work on that. And out of 51 tail spikes that they looked at, 5 of them were pathological. So again, I try and get classes to think about the fact that's 10% of the tail spikes that exist in the museum are pathological, and 51 spikes minimally represents at least 13 different stegosaurs, because they only have 4 on them per thing. It's probably actually, I would imagine it represents a lot more individuals than that. But it's not, they're broken and healed, and they've got other kind of nastiness on them. So that's kind of intriguing. That's kind of cool. It implies that they were being used. But the all-time best specimen is this one. And this isn't a stegosaurus specimen. This is an Allosaurus, like the skeleton here on the right. This is an Allosaurus tail vertebra, and it's got this perforation in it. Right? I mean, you can readily tell, and that's one of the nice things. You don't have to be much of an anatomist to identify a paleopathology, because usually the bone is massively asymmetrical. Well, if you take a thagomizer spike, you can actually fit it into this hole. And so Carpenter and his colleagues argued that this really is indeed evidence that this particular an Allosaurus, not that particular Allosaurus. Whoa. This one that they're showing here was in fact stabbed by a thagomizer tail, absorbed an injury from a stegosaurus. I mean, that's pretty fantastic. And unfortunately, I mean, so far as I know, I'm showing you the best pictures. They're in one of the I think it's one of the Indiana University Press books. And of course, it's the published paleo literature from almost 20 years ago. So it's black and white. And so really, we need some people out there making some nice color graphics and so on. So I think that these sort of things do give us insights into the biology and show that these things really were using these. I mean, it's not really a surprise. On the other hand, this is something that falsifies a hypothesis that maybe it's really just a display feature. Maybe that's just to look good or to look intimidating or whatever. And I mean, it seems like if the rarity that it would take to preserve one of these things and then to preserve one with an injury is really compelling, that they were actually being used. So now diseases are trickier because, again, of all the diseases that an animal could possibly experience, we can really only speak to the ones that leave a trace on the skeleton. And of course, many of those are infections, and many of those presumably had an external cause. So a lot of times they're actually, they're the result perhaps of an injury. And even something where even if there's not a tooth in it, one wonders if the infection itself might have been caused by a soft tissue injury or an injury on a bone that we didn't recover. So it's difficult to tell, but it's especially in fossil vertebrates, osteomyelitis, which leaves these nasty, exostoses that grow all over the bone, are really pretty gnarly looking stuff. Those happen. There is now evidence. People have argued back and forth. This is the most recent article on bone cancer in a dinosaur, and they argue that this is really the only evidence of an osteosarcoma. It was on a fibula, I think it was, of a small centrosaurine dinosaur. So there are things like that. And I mean, this fibula, keep in mind, this is a Tyrannosaurus rex. That's Sue, the adult. So that scale bar is a foot long. This fibula is probably the most gnarly dinosaur bone you can imagine as far as paleopathology that must have been really unpleasant. And in fact, Sue is riddled with paleopathology. She has all kinds of holes and things in her jaws that might include some puncture wounds. She has multiple vertebrae that are pathological. The fibula is pathological. So this one skeleton has actually a lot of paleopathologies on it. Something weird happening on the ribs, fractured ribs, or actually and even the dinky, right, two claws on the hand and a Tyrannosaurus rex, and one of those is pathological on Sue. The humerus is really messed up. I mean, this animal, and these injuries, many of them are healed, right? So these are things this animal experienced and survived and went on to live for quite some time. There's little, if any, evidence that any of these things were whatever killed the animal. So this brings me back to this huge compendium that Tanke and Rothschild had made. And basically I trusted them. They had gone through it and they had listed all these things, but they were so comprehensive that they listed all manner of abstracts and other sorts of things that are really not truly in the scientific literature, that have not been peer reviewed. So the first thing I did was I thought to myself when I was doing the page layout, trying to get all this to look as pretty as it could, that they organized everything by what animals and by what conditions were in those animals. And that makes sense. I mean, Bruce is an MD. They're basically looking at this from a very biological perspective. Well, I'm a geologist, so the first question I thought was, well, what time frames are represented? Which time frames do these things take place in? So originally I had Katie go through it, and she just went through the whole thing and took their word on everything and compiled them all into time bins. And then Logan came along a couple years later, and he went through it, and we culled it down to just the peer-reviewed references, just the articles that had gone through peer review that had a paleopathology in it. And then Zach's been working on that ever since, okay? And so the amazing thing is that there are at least 244 dinosaur specimens with pathologies, and you just saw that Sue has at least half a dozen. So, and these are the peer-reviewed ones. There's many, many more that are still out there. As a matter of fact, at this last year's Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting, a woman pointed out another pathology on Sue. It's the teeth. I think it's related to the jaw. Victoria Arbor had a really neat presentation on pathology. Kerry Woodruff had a pathology on a sauropod dinosaur, and this guy named Bertozzo he has been going over all the hadrosaurs he can. So there's actually going to be dozens more specimens entering the peer-reviewed literature in the not too distant future. Okay, so we now have a very large database. This is just the sauropods. And this is very text heavy. I know it was originally designed for a virtual poster. But we were just asking ourselves, we were trying to ask some somewhat more synthetic questions. So we divided it into injuries versus diseases, because we felt that it was worthwhile to see what kind of things were injuries, what kind of things were diseases, and what does that mean if things don't have injuries on them? Does that mean that they didn't occur, or just that they didn't, or that they're not survivable? So we went through that whole database, and we have all the animals indexed by when and time they occurred. We have them arranged by major group of dinosaurs, and we also organized them by body size. Okay, so whether, and we just took orders of magnitude in kilograms, whether it's an animal that weighed tens or hundreds, thousands, or some of the sauropods, of course, are really big. And these are the clades. So on the rest of my charts, you're going to see these clades, the marginocephalian, which essentially, I think there's like one or two definitively paleopathological pachycephalosaurs, but it's essentially ceratopsians. The ornithopod record is largely hadrosaurs, but could include things like iguanodon and whatnot. The stegosaurs, of course, and the ankylosaurs are the thyreoperans, sauropods, and then, of course, the theropods. So we indexed all the animals in all these different ways, and where they showed up, and when they lived, and so on. And importantly, because we only did peer-reviewed animals, the Acrocanthosaurus there, I mean, it's obviously pathological. You don't have to know anything about biology to know that the distal scapula or the end of the scapula should not look like that. So especially when the right one or the left one doesn't, the right one looks like that and the left one does not. But it's never really been analyzed. It's never really showed up in peer-reviewed literature. So again, everything we do, we know is a minimum effort. And so the first thing we realized once we started looking at this, and this is not to us at all surprising, is that the overwhelming number of the paleopathologies in the peer-reviewed literature are from North American dinosaurs. And given that Hankey, Rothschild, Moody, Arbor, Farkey are all North Americans, that ceratopsians are North American almost exclusively, and so on down the line, that's really not terribly surprising. There's a long record of North American paleopathologies. It is a little surprising that there's essentially nothing from some of these other places. So that's exciting, and then that tells us that surely there are, we could be finding more pathological specimens. They're already in collections in some of these other places. And so then when you organize the paleopathological record by time, we felt like it pretty much mimics the North American record. Of course, all those hadrosaurs and ceratopsians and tyrannosaurs and everything running around in the late Cretaceous, those are, that's the North American record is exceptionally rich in the late Cretaceous, and so we see a lot of paleopathologies. And then the late Jurassic, of course, is the Morrison Formation, the stegosaurs and the allosaurs and the big sauropods. So we felt like this probably is essentially is so much of the record is North American that when you divide it up by time, it's not surprising that it also looks pretty North American. Almost all the paleopathologies that we know about in dinosaurs are in pretty big animals. The animals that weigh at least 1,000 kilograms and maybe even 10,000 or more, 83% of them, the vast, vast majority of them. And there's probably several reasons for that. Most collected dinosaurs are of large animals. So, and then, but there are other questions. In smaller animals, did they not occur, or were they not survivable? And so one of the things, like with all those fractures, small animal, things I like to say to people is small animals bounce, big animals break. If you are a small, if you're a velociraptor or a Deinonychus, you can take a fall or a tumble or whatever, and you're not going to shatter bones. If you are an Acrocanthosaurus and you fall over, you're breaking ribs. That's just the way the world works. And again, for a true paleopathology to show up, the animal has to survive it long enough to initiate healing and so on. So this is very, it's not surprising to us that the vast majority of these records are of large animals. And we're just not totally sure how we can kind of normalize that. One thing I would point out is the Coelophysis bone bed at Ghost Ranch, which has all or parts of hundreds of Coelophysis specimens. And so far, I have only ever even heard of one of them being paleopathological. And I was told that the bone was removed to get at a skull that was under it. And that's the closest I've ever heard to there being a paleopathology in Coelophysis, hundreds of individuals. And you're going to see that big theropods, right? I mean, they're riddled with them. So, so when we tried to put this all together, and yeah, I've been watermarking things because I mean, this really is unpublished data, and these aren't super sensitive, but I'd appreciate people not really sharing them. But I mean, what we did see, is that overall pathologies, 30% of the overall pathologies are in theropods, and 26% of them are marginal cephalians. So 56% of all the paleopathologies are in euclades of dinosaurs. And theoretically, if pathologies are evenly distributed, then they should more or less match the fossil record of those animals. So unless marginal cephalians are 26% of the overall dinosaur record, then something's a little wacky here. And when you go to injuries, it actually gets worse. Things that are demonstrably injuries and healed, it's 35% of them are in theropods and 36% of them are in marginal cephalians. So that's really striking. But and I didn't think I wanted to go there quite yet. Until we can normalize that, until we can compare and contrast to the actual record, though, it's going to be very difficult to say anything more about that. So we brought Carano in because he's one of the major gurus of dinosaur data in the paleobiology database. And so if you look at overall the total record of specimens in museums, catalog specimens in museums that are in the literature and so on, what you can see here is that while 70-ish% of the paleopathological specimens are from North America, that really only about, the colors got swapped on, only about 43% of them are of the total number of specimens. So we are over-reporting North American paleopathologies relative to other places, which is exciting because that means that all of these places, essentially all of Gondwana, there's a lot of specimens surely down there that are waiting to be described. Theropods, there's this article, it's open access too. If you look up Dilophosaurus, the original, or Dilophosaurus, I don't really care. The type specimen riddled with injuries. Sioux, riddled with injuries. Big Al, the Allosaurus, multiple injuries. Big Al 2 has multiple injuries on it. So these theropods are walking indexes of paleopathology. These big theropods absorbed a lot of injury. Whoops. So I would argue that it looks to me like if you are a big theropod, you absorbed a lot of injuries over the course of your lifetime. If you grew to adulthood, you almost surely have broken bones or whatever. Because keep in mind that no matter how much we rave about many of those skeletons, they're still only 30 or 40% complete. They're not 100% complete. There's there's ample opportunity for there to be other broken ribs, broken tailbones, and so on, things like that. So what we walked away from with our kind of initial analysis was that the paleopathological record of dinosaurs is the North American record. It's definitely biased towards large body size animals, and we felt that there are some real implications here. That theropods and marginal cephalians are probably engaging in antagonistic behavior, is what we would call it, because they are injured. They look to be disproportionately injured. But like I say, we bring in Carano and the paleobiological database to really try and test all these things. So all of those things you need to test against a null hypothesis. Is that record of when dinosaur injuries occur really weird, or is it just when we find dinosaurs, and so on? And I mean, pretty much, right off the bat, if theropods, which are really the only dinosaurs that can be predatory, and they represent 30% of the injuries, right? There isn't a modern ecosystem of largely endothermic animals, of large animals in the world, where 30% of them are predators. So maybe on islands with like monitor lizards and things, you can do that. But in a landscape, if lions were 30% of the animals on the Serengeti, then pretty soon there wouldn't be any large animals in the Serengeti. So it's pretty clear that theropods are engaging in predation and are getting injured. Now, a lot of those injuries, I can't tell you whether they get them by hunting large animals or by fighting each other over large animals once they've killed them, but for whatever reason, theropods absorb a lot of injuries. The geographic bias, I think, probably is real. We can definitely, if go to Gondwana, when the Argentines and the Brazilians start really describing specimens in their collections, not just as new animals, but really start describing the skeletons of those animals they are going to be finding and reporting paleopathologies. The size bias is going to be very difficult to normalize. But again, theropods, margins of salience, I think we can say that they very much have evidence of antagonistic behavior. And the other thing I'd say is that, like sauropodomorphs, the record of paleopathologies on sauropodomorphs is essentially all things like osteoarthritis or whatever. It's things that you really would not be surprised that an animal that lived for decades and grew to be 20, 30 tons, it's really not surprising that it would have accumulated some osteoarthritis or other sort of injuries related, or diseases related to senescence. There's very few injuries reported in sauropodomorphs. So going through all that, then hopefully in this time, everybody's got a better feel for paleopathology and with the study of them, and hopefully I've made an impression as to what kind of dinosaurs experienced them, when and where those occurred, and what we think those might relate to paleobiologically, and where we might be able to go from there. So the one thing I would say that I don't have a diagram of and that my people are working on right now is the other thing is where on their skeletons do we find them? And we're trying to think of a way to break that up that's robust and biologically meaningful. And right now we're leaning towards skull jaws, vertebral column, anterior to the hips, forelimb, hind limb, rib / gastralia, and then the tail. Because one of the things we're going to find out, and we know from stuff coming, is that like hadrosaurs have an amazing number of injuries, but they're all on their tails. And some of them are bite injuries, but some of them are probably just getting stepped on, or it's thought some of them may even be mating injuries. But regardless, hadrosaurs are going to end up looking like they experienced a huge number of injuries, but they're mostly on their tail. One thing I've been trying to tease my peers with is there are essentially no dinosaur femora with pathologies recorded on them. There is essentially not one femur of a dinosaur with a paleopathology that's been described. I've seen one on display at the LA County Museum, but the implication is that if your femur gets injured as a dinosaur, you're done, and you don't survive it. But that I have seen one, and if I were a paleopathologist, I'd be all over it, but I'm not. I'm just trying to kind of accumulate the record. So I think that is all the stuff that was really kind of prepared to show. So I greatly appreciate you guys' attention, and I have not, as I promised, I was not able to monitor the chat, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions. So I think I'll stop sharing and take a look in the chat. Okay, so I do see that I had a question. Is there any reason to think that animals with a pathology might be over or underrepresented in the fossil record, or does the assumption of a normal distribution hold? I think, fundamentally, I still think that fossilization itself is pretty stochastic. So I think it's going to be pretty random that an animal enters the fossil record. To get at that answer, I mean, the best way to really look at that is going to be to go look at the Centrosaurus bone beds. Like I said, the Coelophysis bone bed has essentially no pathologies that we can tell. There's caveats to that too, and that a lot of those specimens were prepared on the naked eye in the 40s and 50s. And so it's possible that people prepped away weird stuff just because they were trying to do it with the naked eye, not under a microscope with great glues and such. But I don't think there's a reason for a pathological animal to be more likely to be in the fossil record than not, other than that, I can't, the relatively untestable assertion that, well, maybe it stayed near a body of water, maybe it crawled off a bog or something or other to lay down and die, and therefore was more likely to die in a place with preservation potential, and possibly, but I don't know that I could really test that. So and because complete skeletons are so rare, I feel pretty confident in saying that these 250 some peer-reviewed specimens that represent probably close to 300 pathologies, again, must be underrepresenting the total count, because many of those specimens are not complete. So I think that was the only question I have in the chat right now, but I'm happy to answer questions either in the chat or unmute yourself. And
Andy, I've got a question.
Sure, Linda.
Okay, so you said that there's not much data on modern predatory animals or otherwise wild animals.
Right.
But have you checked to see if places that monitor their wildlife, like wildlife sanctuaries, where there are lions and wildebeest, et cetera, do they monitor when an animal dies and check for injuries like that? Are there any places that do?
I wouldn't be surprised if they do. It's the whole way. I mean, one of the things that kind of, it's not a dinosaur, but I got into this in part because of a really wickedly pathological phytosaur actually at the Smithsonian, and it would be a good place to go. I figured that's a dissertation for somebody else. I've done my dissertation, but I would say that like Kay Berensmeyer at the Smithsonian has done a lot of work on modern taphonomy of the Serengeti and these Amboseli and these places like that, to try and figure out to what extent do the bones they see laying out in the landscape, what kind of fidelity do those have with the landscape. So no, it's certainly very viable. We feel in preliminary discussions with people, they feel that zoo data is probably not very good. Not only are the animals not really in a natural environment behaving naturally, but infections and things like that are notoriously rampant in zoos. So, which is too bad, because when we started working on this phytosaur, it turned out one of my childhood friends was, my best friend really in high school, was a pathologist at the National Zoo. So she has a record of thousands of paleopathologies in the National Zoo. Just to give you a tease here, let me play a short little movie for you. Whoa. So this is a phytosaur humerus, and all the yellow is extra. Let's replay that. Is pathological bone, and so I was so excited when I first saw this thing, because nobody had really described it, and you can see that it has these big holes, and I kind of thought they were bite marks, but instead this is all reactive bone surface. It probably had osteomyelitis or something like that, and so those aren't bite wounds, those are possibly draining tracts or something else like that. Really gross. So you're welcome, everybody who's eating lunch during the during the presentation here. But I mean, they're pretty spectacular specimens. Some of these things very spectacularly gross. Okay, so actually, I'm sorry, I did see another thing. Collecting and sampling biases, absolutely. I mean, I do think that part of the bias is part of the reason the theropods are so nasty, and part of the reason there's a North American bias is just that there's a lot of people in North America who want to do paleontology, and there are a lot of North American collections. And if you can't be somebody who's out describing new animals and find pathological things and describe them, and certainly tyrannosaurs are horribly overstudied at some level. I mean, one year they told us at Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting that there were more abstracts submitted on Tyrannosaurus than there were on fish. And I'm not, I contribute to that. I don't really work on fish, but I mean, fish deserve to have more scientific study than tyrannosaurs, and if we're going to try and get a real handle on things. So there's absolutely some real collecting and sampling biases. We actually know essentially nothing about ceratopsian postcrania injuries and diseases, partly because those skulls are just so robust that a lot of those specimens, even if they intended to collect the whole thing, it's a skull and 4 limb bones, and that's the only things that didn't get washed away, and everything else got washed away, or was shattered and exploded when they found it. So there's very definitely some collecting and sampling biases, and that's one of the things we're hoping that something like this kind of addresses. And so absolutely, I think that if more fossils are discovered in Africa, I'm actually surprised that there aren't more recorded out of Africa right now, but keep in mind that a big chunk of the South African record is late Triassic and early Jurassic, relatively smaller animals. And so maybe not as thoroughly described. But no, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that as we get a better handle on the Indian fossil record, the subcontinent of India's fossil record, the Argentine fossil record, the Brazilian fossil record, the sub-Saharan fossil record, that all of those things are going to start changing that. China should surely, although again, all those beautiful fossils from Liaoning are relatively small animals. And so if they go through all those things in Liaoning and they don't really find that many more pathological specimens, and that would sort of bear out the hypothesis that small animals just don't survive pathological things long enough to preserve them. But no, I absolutely think that there's a number of biases there. And I mean, I don't think anybody's going to be really surprised by that. We're just going to try and codify it a little bit better. And what else? I see specific causes of pathologies. Absolutely. Roy Moody really did pioneering work in the teens and 20s, and we get it. I mean, and uniformitarianism is not without its challenges. I mean, we're looking at this phytosaur that clearly had some sort of nasty infectious-like thing, but we are making a bit of an assumption that the animals that infected, the microorganisms that infect crocodilians today would have a similar effect on proto-crocodilians 200 million years ago. And just like there aren't phytosaurs today, surely whatever those microbes are causing those infections are different. So yeah, no, there's lots of, and for my part, I'm trying to stay largely out of those fights. I mean, I am not an MD. I've never taken a histology class or things like that. So I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of what exactly these bone surfaces look like or so on. And we're going to have a founder's effect. Like I say, there's this guy Bertozzi. I saw his database. He showed it at Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, and we really desperately need to publish before he publishes his database, because then it's going to create another hole. I mean, he's going to bring like hundreds of paleopathologies into play. But that's because he's looked at all these specimens, and that North American record of hadrosaurs and ceratopsians is just so rich that the more specimens we look at, the more we're going to find. So I think I've got everything in the chat. Again, you're welcome to unmute yourself too. But yeah, going forward, our plan is to, like I said, really index it by body part. And that's also going to allow us to get a better handle on just how many pathologies there are. Because right now we really have it indexed by specimen, but many of those theropods in particular have multiple pathologies on them. So we're hoping to do that and then do some finalized compare and contrast. And some, you know, and we're going to let Carano do some statistics on that to see what the, you know, what we can say about the story. But I think we're going to be able to, yeah, I think some of the things that really jump out at you are going to survive any statistical test you throw at it. Theropods, large theropods, led, you know, lifestyles that resulted in the accumulation of a lot of injuries and pathologies. Ceratopsians almost surely were interspecifically aggressive with each other, especially the ones with the long brow horns, and definitely did a lot of damage to each other. I suspect that we're going to be able to show that sauropods, you know, if they made it to adulthood, then they were pretty immune. They, you know, they just kind of lumbered across the landscape and eventually got osteoarthritis or whatever. I guess one thing that's pretty clear to us, but maybe I should have emphasized more, is it's almost impossible to say that an animal died of the whatever paleopathologies it has. We can tell that they were present, but it's very difficult to say whether or not that was fatal. One of the abstracts this year, they made a case for a particular disease that is always fatal whenever the animal gets it. So in that case, that one would be a case where that is true. But for as badly, you know, I mean, Sue must have lived a substantial portion of her life in a great deal of pain. But we can't prove, I don't think, that any of those injuries actually led to the death of the animal.
Can you hear me? This is Trish. Can you hear me?
Are there any more questions?
Somebody's asking if I can hear them, but I can't tell.
This is Trish. Can you hear me?
It's Trish who's trying to ask a question.
That's better, Trish. Oh,
Yes, Trish.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions. The first one is, do you all have any specimens there in your fossil lab that show paleopathology on dinosaurs? Of course, all of us probably have plenty on whales and dolphins and other animals, but do you have any in your lab that show paleopathology on just dinosaurs?
Other than that Triceratops, we don't have anything in the lab that is got a paleopathology. I do have a cast of the Phytosaur paleopathology, although this seldom works well. But you can see this is and it's always backwards, but here's the deltopectoral crest here. And this should just be a little smooth bump, you know, that's where the pectoral muscle attaches. And instead, you can see it's this wildly rugose texture and that volcano there, that shouldn't be there. You're not supposed to have either of those, either this one or this one. Where'd it go? Here. Those volcanoes aren't supposed to be on that bone. So, and then did you have a follow-up to that too, Trish?
Yeah, I have another question. In the observations and the research they've done on the dinosaurs, were there any really good bite marks around the neck and throat region, like the cervical vertebra? You know, because when you think of lions and wolves, they go right for the throat. But did dinosaurs do that?
Well, again, remember that it's you do have to survive that injury and have some healing to really show that for it to count as a paleopathology and not just a bite mark. And I would say that, to my knowledge, most of the bite marks that have been preserved in the fossil record that would show definitive healing, most of those are on the tail. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the animal got bit on the tail, but appears to have escaped the predation event at least long enough to initiate healing. And in the case of that one I showed you guys, I mean, again, I don't know anything about pathologic bone growth, but I've got to think that dinosaur, in order to have that mass and completely encapsulate two vertebrae, I mean, that I would like to think that's at least weeks or months of healing. Tyrannosaurs, I do know that some tyrannosaurs have have nastiness in and around their necks. You can see fused vertebrae and things, but again, probably as much related to bashing each other, tangling with each other. I don't think they're necessarily bite related. They're probably breaks related to antagonistic behavior.
Thank you.
Andy, I got more of an observation than a question.
Sure.
When it comes to human remains and our cousins, we're aware that Neanderthals have a lot more bone damage than Homo sapiens per se. So I'm wondering if you were saying that Sue was probably in a lot of pain. I don't know that that's actually true. What if, let's say that Neanderthals compared to Homo sapiens simply had a different threshold for pain, and therefore, they break a bone and say, okay, well, broke a bone, keep on moving, and it heals, and they just go on about their business, and they don't feel pain in the same way as another similar looking organism would. So we break the same bone and we'd be laid up for a week, but they break a bone and keep on walking on it. So maybe the theropods just had a higher threshold of pain, and so they would get these injuries and just walk it off.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, certainly, I know that pain thresholds are demonstrably different across human populations, generally speaking. And every time I'm out west and and I find the remains of somebody's cabin somewhere, I just go, whoever those people were, they are a lot tougher than I am. I mean, it is anthropomorphizing to say that the animal was definitely in a great deal of pain, but at the other level, I mean, I'm sure that nothing else at the moment of impact or whatever caused those things. I did not get to take a class from Eric Trinkhaus at UNM. He left, but he was one of those first guys to really look at the Neanderthals and say, for reference, that if you look at populations of Neanderthal skeletons, in order to get a handle on a modern human population with injuries like that, you basically had to look at like rodeo workers and things like that. It was people who worked, with large wildish animals or whatever. And that's why it would be really fun to get more records from game preserves or whatnot, because of course we all know that for every dramatic scene that you see filmed in a nature documentary, those guys were out there for days and days and days and days of not seeing anything. But on the other hand, I mean, to me, it's honestly intriguing that there's at least, and like I say, we're only using the peer-reviewed things. There are plenty of things in abstracts where I'm absolutely sure that is a paleopathology. And we just didn't want to include them because sometimes the diagnosis is very sketchy and sometimes it's not. And we just didn't want to get into, okay, well, we trust this guy, but we don't trust this guy. Or I saw this talk and I saw those bones, but you can't see, So we went with only the peer-reviewed publications. Although admittedly, even there, sometimes people just that doesn't really mean the pathology was peer reviewed. It means the paper was peer reviewed, but sometimes they're just like, oh, and it had 3 broken ribs. And that's probably true. That's a fair statement, but
Andy, do you think anybody's done any research on, say, like not modern, but fossil mammal prey versus predator injury amounts, maybe at La Brea when they have I know that's predator heavy traps. There's not as many prey animals, but what percentage of those predators, even though they were mammals, had injuries compared to the prey, and maybe look at that as an analogy for, say, your predator prey interactions in the dinosaur world?
I'm sure that it has been done with La Brea. As you say, it is a predator trap, so it's got an overwhelming number of predators. And I think many of those animals are fairly well associated. so the short answer is I don't know, but yeah, someplace like La Brea would be the best bet, or other places that might be intriguing to really look at would be, say, like Ashfall, someplace where
Right.
you have
And
a
just see,
reasonable
yeah, and just see
snapshot.
if there's any correlation between predators have more injuries, larger things
Right.
don't, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
and see if there's a similar analog when the mammals took over.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, we're certainly hoping that we can, finish this project up and get it out there, and then that people will want to start investigating some of those other questions in greater detail, and hopefully it'll inspire a bunch of people to describe specimens that are sitting there waiting to be described. I mean, I've shown, when I've talked about this or shown friends this stuff, when I've been in their museum, they've got like, oh yeah, well, we've got this thing and this thing, but we haven't written it up yet or whatever. Yeah, we're hoping that it'll be like any good research project, it'll inspire as many questions as it answers, maybe more. Any evidence that dinosaurs could regrow tails like modern reptiles? Not dinosaurs, but there is actually, there's a fossil record of autonomous tails, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but it definitely goes back to the Jurassic. And I think I've got some friends saying that there are some Triassic animals that can do that too. But keep in mind that the dinosaurs are on the Archosaur line, and the things that regrow tails are all on the Lepidosauur line. Off the top, and it's weird. I mean, the fossil one, I remember seeing an example of a Jurassic one where you really can see where that centrum is just ready to pop right in the middle, because that's a really weird thing, if I recall correctly, about things that that lose their tails and can regrow them, is that they actually snap across the centrum, not between bones, but they actually snap across the middle of the bone. I don't think that any dinosaur can do that. There's no real record of them doing that. There's at least one animal from Madagascar, and that's one of the things that also happens. It sort of fragments the record as you get into these complicated. Looking at the breakup of Gondwana, there are times when Africa, Madagascar, and India probably are all the same landmass, and then there's other times that they're not, and which one split from which in what order. So our index down there gets kind of chopped up. But there is an animal from Madagascar whose tail was largely amputated. There's a dinosaur who's got essentially no tail. Well, the tail goes down for 8, 10 vertebrae, whatever, and then it's in some nasty, gnarly mess. And there's just the rest of the tail's gone. But I don't think dinosaurs could have regrown tails. It's intriguing to think about that. If you ever doubted that sauropods held their tails up, the fact of the matter is there's no crushing of sauropod tails. There's no specimens where it looks like the things ever got stepped on. So they really did spend decades with that thing waving around the air behind them. So. Well, again, thank you very much, everybody. I hope everybody got something out of that. Appreciate the compliments in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That was absolutely fantastic.